We can grab the sword, it's straight up, and then we've got our second controller, which actually controls whereabouts we have it moved to. So it's like, which is really good. So we can teleport over. We can then grab with our left controller, and we see we've got it working. We can't shoot with our left trigger, which is quite nice. So it's only our right. And then if I let go with the right controller, which is currently on our trigger, it snaps to the left controller. And now we can actually fire with that one. And then we can grab it again. We do it. We can't fire with the right, but we can fire with the left. So that's pretty much how we get two-handed weapons working. Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So before we get started, you might want to grab yourself a coffee, a cup of tea, or if you're doing this at like 1 in the morning, maybe an energy drink. So in this one, we're going to do two-handed weapons. We're going to use the OpenXR plugin for it, so the basis of 4.27 and Unreal Engine 5. For engine versions, I am using Unreal Engine 5 because I think we're pretty soon probably going to be switching over to it. And it's the same process for 4.27 if you need it as well. So don't worry about what version you're using. There might just be a couple of little bugs you might experience along the way. For one, once we start editing the motion controller pawn, you might find your teleportation and your motion doesn't work. You will need to restart the editor and reopen it. But after that, you should be good to go. So try and follow through as much as possible. If you need any help along the way, feel free to jump over to the Discord. Link is literally right on that side. And then drop us a message in one of the VR chats and we'll be able to help you out. So pretty much let's jump straight back in and then we'll get started. So let's go. Okay, so we're in the project, just the normal template. I am using the HTC Vive. It'll work for any headset. We don't have to worry about that. But the first thing we're going to do is go to our VR template, our blueprints folder, and open up our grab component. This is where we're going to do a majority of the work, or almost all of it. But we will be bouncing around in different places. So if it gets confusing, I apologize, but just go through this at maybe half speed, or watch it through in 1.5 speed to begin with, and then follow along, because it's just probably going to be easier. So first thing we're going to do is go to our try grab function. And this is where we're going to do, or at least start off with what we need. So move the try grab to the left. And I'm going to start by adding 2 branch nodes. I'm just going to hold B on the keyboard to do this. And I'm going to connect these up like so. True to the top branch. And we're going to put that over there. And we're going to make sure our false channel goes to our sequence. What we want to do now is right click on our conditions and promote these to a variable. And the first one is going to be called can second hand grab. And we'll do a question mark on that one. Move it down. And our second one for our second branch, and it's going to be called can use 2 hands. Like so. And make sure we add a question mark. Just so we know what we're doing. Now that we have both of our branches created, we're going to need to create a custom function. So we're going to hit the plus on our functions list. And we're going to call this second hand grab, like so. And what we want to do now is add an input for our motion controller component. So on inputs, with our function selected, we want to search motion controller component. Hit enter twice so we add it in. Actually, we're just going to call this motion controller. And from here, we want to promote this to a variable. And this is going to be called second controller. Then we're going to do an is valid check from it. So rather than dragging off this pin, we're going to actually get a reference to it. So get and then search is valid. And we want the one with a question mark. And we're going to connect that like so. And from here, we're going to actually fire a custom event, but we don't have it yet, so we need to create that. And to do that, we're going to go to our event graph. We're going to scroll down a little bit so we've got some free space. And this custom event is going to be called two-handed, like so. And now we can go back to our second hand grab function and search two-handed. And you'll see that we get our call function, two-handed, like so. We hit compile, so this just updates. And now we can go back to our try grab. And we can bring in that function that we've just created. So bring in second hand grab, get our function. So can use two hands is true. We're going to set our motion controller to be the one that's coming through our try grab. And we're just going to tidy this up. Before we move on, we want to make sure our bools are actually set to false. So you can do that by selecting them and then going on the bottom left. By default, they're set to true. So we're going to set those to false because we're going to control those later on. Now that we have our second hand grab function, we want to go back to our event graph and we're going to create another custom event. And this is going to be called reset two-handed. So let's do the spaces just so it's easier to read. And while we're here, we might as well add the do once. So we're going to need a do once here. So once we fire the two-handed, we'll go through this section of code that we'll do later on. And then we can reset this once we release our hand. And that's what we're going to set up now is the releasing, just because it's quite a bit to cover and it's a bit easier to do at this point in the video. It's just easier to cover. So the first thing we're going to do is go to our try release function, which is located here. If you can't find them, just remember that you can access them from the functions panel on the left. And we're going to put a function in between our try release and our sequence. So we're going to create a new function called release second hand. And then here we're going to do quite a bit. First thing we'll do is reset our two-handed. And then we'll check to see if our second controller is valid. So from our variables, second controller get do is valid. And we're going to follow this up with a branch. And the reason we're doing a branch here is because there's two ways we can hold this weapon. We can have it so our hand, our mesh itself, snaps to the gun where we want it to rest. Or we can give the option to have it so it kind of floats in front, so the front of the gun follows. This works really well if something's really small or really close together. And it just gives a little bit more functionality to the overall blueprint itself. So we're going to right click and promote this branch to a variable. And this is going to be called snap second hand to socket. By default, we're going to have this set to false. So we need to compile false. And we're also going to make this public. And what that'll do is if we hit compile and save, when we select our weapon, if we actually go to the grab component itself, we'll be able to access that in here. And then we want to make this public like so. So once we hit compile and we select our weapon, let's say we select this one, we can go to grab component and we say snap second hand to the socket, which we'll add later on. So now that we have that set up, we can go to our second controller and we're going to drag off and we're going to get our display component. Get display component. And while we're here, we're also going to get the world transform. And we're going to split this pin like so. So we've got that. And then we'll just tidy this up because we're going to need quite a few offcuts of this essentially. So now we need to right click and do detach from component, followed by an attach component to component, followed by a set world location and rotation. So now that we have all those set up, we want to connect our display component to all three of the targets. Just like so. And we're going to tidy this up, otherwise it's going to get very messy very fast. Which might be easier to plug that one into there, and then that one into there. We don't actually want to change anything with our detach from component, but we can plug it into our true from our branch. And then we can attach our detached component to our attached component, followed to our set world location and rotation. And what we want to do now is set up our attached component to component. We're going to do that by getting our second controller, and I'm going to do a reroute node, and then plugging that into our parent, and then changing our location rule to snap to target and rotation rule also snap to target. In this case, we don't actually need to set a socket name, but what we do need to do is set up our set world location and rotation values. And that's as easy as connecting our location to our new location and our rotation to our rotation. like so. So what's happening here is if we snap our second hand to our socket, we're going to attach the component from the actual controller, and then we're going to attach the mesh to our gun, essentially. And then we're going to set the location and rotation so we can control that. And now all we need to do is set our second controller to be empty. So we're going to set to be empty. And if we don't want it to snap, we're just going to have it set our second controller to empty. Like so. So we should have our release second hand. We reset our two-handed. We then check to see if the second controller is valid. And we say whether we want to snap it or we don't. In most cases, I actually like it when you don't snap the controller to the mesh. It just feels a little bit nicer. But it's there for you guys to play around with and check out. We then get the world location and transform, so we rotate it around to match the weapon. And then at the very end, we then set the controller back to empty, so we can start all over again. Now that we've done that, we can go back to our try release, and we can add in our function that we just created. So release second hand, we drop that in between, and that's it for our release. While we're in the try release function, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the very end, we're going to find is held, and we're going to add two more nodes onto this. So we're going to do get can second hand grab. We're going to set this to false. And then we want to set our second controller, again, just to empty. Now we can actually compile. And that's it for our try release. And what we want to do is make sure, before we move on, that can use two hands is set to public. And can second hand grab is also set to, actually, can second hand grab can stay false. So we just want can use two hands set to public, snap second hand to socket as public. So we compile and save. So now that we actually have our grab and release stuff set up, we can actually go over to our event graph and start setting up all the rotation stuff. So once we grab stuff, how to have the mesh follow different things. And we're going to set this up for a gun and a sword, but the sword one will be a bit more tricky as it depends on the way you import it. But we'll have a look at that later on. So the first thing we'll do is actually work from our event tick, and we'll do that by creating a branch. Then we're going to do that by checking to see if we can use two hands. So we'll get. So what we're doing here is we're checking to see if two hands is enabled on the blueprint or the component itself. And we're going to then check to see if a second controller is valid. So get is valid. And here we want to do another branch. But this time, rather than using a blueprint or a boolean that we've already got, we're going to create a new one. And we're going to call this is item sword, just so we know what we're working with. So if it is a sword, we're going to do one thing. If it's not a sword, it means it's going to be a gun of some sort. Then we can do a different thing. And by default, we want this set to be false. So we hit compile. Change that to false. And now we're going to create two more custom events lower down. So we're going to do custom event. We're going to call this is gun. And then we're going to make another one is sword. Cool. So from our true, it'll be is item a sword. If that's true, it'll be is sword. And then if it's false, it means it's gun, so is gun. Now what we can do is set up our socket controls. So by default, we've got this. So if two-handed is enabled, we're going to check if snap second hand to socket is true. And if it is, we're then going to move the mesh to a location on a gun of our choosing. And the easiest way to do that is through a socket itself. So what we'll do is we'll drag off the do once, we'll create the branch, and we'll get snap second hand to socket. And we're going to create a attach component to component. At the minute, our gun or our mesh doesn't have a socket, so we need to create that now so we can reference it. And to do this, it's as easy as finding our mesh. And in this case, it's a skeletal mesh for our gun. So we're going to go to FPS weapon, mesh, and then we want to open up our skeleton. And in here, we can see that we've got our root bones. This is where we can add our grips. So you can already see by default, we have a grip point, which is used to tell our hand or controller where it needs to go. So all we're really going to do is create another one of these. So we're going to right click. We're going to create a new socket by selecting our grip bone. We're going to right click and then go add socket. And in this case, we're going to call it grip 2. So we can do that by double clicking and then deleting the end. So grip point 2. And you can just double click and then copy this. And while we're here, we want to actually move this. So pressing W on the keyboard with the grip point selected or the socket, you can then move this to where you want the second hand to be placed on the weapon. I'm going to put this quite close to the front because it just looks a little bit more natural. But you could place it down here. Let's just do it roughly there. And then what we can do is we can go back to our grab component now. But make sure you've got the grip point name saved. And in our socket, we're just going to paste that socket in there. So what you're going to want to do is if you have weapons, any weapon which requires a second hand will need to be called grip point 2. And you have to add the second socket to every single mesh. Otherwise it won't know where it's going. So just remember, name it the exact same thing in every weapon or every object you plan on picking up. And then this will work all the time. It'll just pick it up. And then we're going to change this location rule to snap to target and rotation rule also to snap to target. Now we want to set up our target and our parent. And we're going to do that by getting our second controller. We're going to get, and we're going to get the display component. Basically the mesh or the hand. So it'll be, in our case, it'll be the controller. And then we're going to plug that into target. And then we're going to get the owner. So get owner. So basically whatever this grab component is attached to, we're going to get that. And then we're going to get root component. And we're going to set that as our parent. And before we forget, we also want to set our bool to be disabled. Compile. And we want to set our isItem stored to public as well. I also realized that we need to actually go back to our try grab and tell our sequence once we're held to actually use the second hand. So after the motion controller reference, we want to make a little bit of space. And we're going to drag off here and say is valid. Plug that in like so. So if the first controller that's grabbing the object is populated, so it is valid, we're going to set can second hand grab to true. So we will set can second hand grab, we'll set that to true, and then we can plug that in like so. So now that we added in our check, we can actually go to our VR template, select one of our weapons and grab components. If we enable can use two hands, yes. Snap second hand to socket, we'll do yes. It's not stored, so we'll leave that blank. We press play, we jump right in. We should be able to grab our gun on the left, and we'll see that our controller, once we go to grab it with our second hand, snaps to the bottom. So it's really small because it's changing the scale to match, and that'll be because I forgot to change one of the relatives or the world scales. And you'll notice that once you let go, it doesn't actually do anything, so we'll do that now. So in our grab component, we want to find our release second hand, and we will set our scale rule for our attach component to component to keep world. We want to set our detach from component to keep world and make sure our attached component to component is also keep world. We also want to go to our event graph and make sure this scale rule is also set to keep world. So now that we set those to keep world, we can actually test this. Now you see we put the headset on, we'll be able to grab the weapon on the left, and our controller actually snaps to the base where that socket is located. And then if we release with our second hand, nothing happens because we haven't set that up yet. But if we release with our right, it actually resets back so we get both controllers. back to normal. But before actually doing the releasing with the second hand, because a lot of that's done in the motion controller pawn, we're going to finish up here and set up these is gun and is sword events. So we're going to start by getting or set world rotation, and we're going to plug that into our event for is gun, and we're going to just copy our get owner and root component for our target. Now we have to do quite a bit of math to get this to follow our gun. So the first thing we'll do is get our motion controller reference, which is our first hand, and then we're going to get our second controller, which is our second. And we're basically going to tell these to look at each other. So our motion controller reference is our first hand. We're going to get world rotation, and we're also going to get world location. Then we're going to duplicate this down for our second controller, and we want to find look at rotation, which we're then going to break the rotation for. So we're going to drag off this, do break rotator. I'm going to copy this up because we want to do the same thing up here. And from our pitch, we want to multiply. We actually want to multiply by -1. And from our yaw, we want to add -90. This is just the easiest way that I found to get it to work, which I know is a bit weird. And then we're going to right click and we're going to make rotator. Now we're going to plug our roll into our pitch, and our pitch into our roll, and then our yaw into our yaw. I think this is to do with the rotation of the weapon as it's brought into Unreal. So you might need to play around with this to get it to work for your end. But it'll just be a matter of changing some of these values and changing the plus to control the rotation based on which way the weapon spawns in the world. We're then going to split our rotator pin. And we want to clamp our values. So clamp float. And the reason we do this is because we don't want it to go all the way around. It just looks a bit weird, and we don't want it to rotate all the way around as well. We kind of want it to lock so it doesn't go upside down. And we're going to just do -80 to 80. Like it is, you can play around with these values and see what works best for yours. But these are what I've found to be probably the nicest values, especially for the gun in here. And then we want to make rotator. So our X roll is going to go to value, our Y pitch is going to go to value, and then our yaw is going to have a reroute node, as it's going to bypass both of these, and they're all going to plug into their corresponding slots. Now with that done, we can actually plug our return value into our rotation, and we'll move all of this along. And while we're here, we might as well comment, or we can do that at the very end. And for our sword, we're actually going to copy most of this, because we can reuse it. So move our sword as event there. And I did actually need the world rotation, so I'll bring that back down. Connect those up like so, make our rotator. And we actually want to delete all of these ones from the center here. So our multiply and add, our make rotator, and our clamps. We want to delete those. And we'll make our rotators line up. And we're just going to plug our roll straight into our pitch. Like I said, I don't know why this math worked. This took a long time for me to figure out, but I had to go from the roll. I had to add -90, so add -90. And then I had to multiply it by -1. So shift star, multiply, -1. And we can plug this into our roll. And then we want to copy our add down, and we want to connect that to our... That was wrong. You want to do the pitch to the add, not the other way. So it should look like that. And then our yaw to our yaw. And that's it for our sword. And like I said, this basically the math in here and for the weapon, these ones, will determine which way it rotates and which way it goes based on the import options and the axis of the object or the thing you're importing. So you might need to change some of these. So have a little play around with those once you get a chance. And we're going to just tidy this up so it looks a little bit neater. And while I'm here, I'm actually going to comment all of this. So we're going to select our two-handed stuff, C, set controller mesh to socket. And then we're going to do the set gun position, and rotation. And then we're going to get our sword and set sword position and rotation as well. And if we press play, so we compile, save, and then we actually press play to jump into our scene, we'll actually be able to see our gun follow our hand. So jump in, we grab it, and then we grab it with our left one, and we can see wherever we rotate and we twist, we can actually control. And then we can even fire it, which is exactly what we're after. So we shoot around corners, and now it's just a matter of setting up the releases and everything else. So now that we know that our rotation and orientation is actually working correctly, what we can do is we can actually jump into our player pawn and start setting that end up instead, or as well. So first thing we're going to do is go to our content folder, our VR template, and then blueprints. And in here, we want to open up our VR pawn. And we see here that we've got our grab left, or input action grab left, and input action grab right. First thing we're actually going to do is modify this section here. And to do that, we're going to start by adding a branch to both of them. And we're going to move the component left over. And we're also going to disconnect the component right as well. So we'll move these up. So we'll just work on these at the same time. So connect these like so from the true. And for the condition, we're actually going to get our can use two hands. So can use two hands. And we're going to plug that in to the top one. And we're going to do the same thing for the bottom or for the left. So can use two hands. Plug that in like so. And we actually want to connect our components or our set components to our false channels. Because what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate, so the left one, so held component left, will go to the top and be plugged into our true. Now held component right will be plugged into our bottom one for our true channel as well. So now that we have our can use two hands and we're resetting those once we let go, we can actually look at our is valid on our release keys. So we're going to start with our grab left. And what we want to do is move this section over and create a sequence. So S on the keyboard, left click, and then plug that in like so. And what we're going to do is copy our right one down here and duplicate that up. So we have our held component left and held component right. Plug that in there. And while we're here, we might as well copy that held component left down below because we're going to need that later on. And then we're going to drag up our held component right and then release second hand. And now we can set up the sequence on the bottom one as well. So drag this over, hold S again, plug them in like so. And we're going to do the same thing and we're going to get held component, release second hand. Excellent. And I couldn't think of an appropriate name for our custom event that we're going to create, but we want to right click above it. So right click above our input action grab right, and we're going to do custom event. And we call this grab right. And we're going to plug that into our get grab component near motion controller grip. Do the same thing for our left one. So custom event, grab left, plug that in like so. And then from our held component left, we want to grab right. So basically what this is doing is if we're holding a weapon with two hands, and then we can release with our second hand like normal, which is fine. But if we're holding the gun and we release with our right hand, which is on the trigger, we're just going to have it snap to our second hand. So it's essentially like a switching. So we can just make that a little bit easier. So now we're going to do the same thing from our bottom one. And then we'll do grab left, like so. And now what we can do is we can hit compile and test. And you might actually get a bug here, which is what I was explaining earlier. So chances are when I start this, I'm not going to be able to teleport. So I've got my guns. So we've got our weapons, we're in the game. And you see if I push forward on the thumbstick, we can't actually do anything because it's just bugged out a little. So I'm going to hit escape. We will save all. And then we're going to restart this and come right back. So now if we test it without opening up our VR pawn, we should be able to pick up our gun. So we can teleport over. We can then grab with our left controller. And we see we've got it working. We can't shoot with our left trigger, which is quite nice. So it's only our right. And then if I let go with the right controller, which is currently on our trigger, it snaps to the left controller. And now we can actually fire with that one. And then we can grab it again. We do it. We can't fire with the right, but we can fire with the left. So that's pretty much how we get two-handed weapons working. And then we can drop, which is exactly what we want. And now we can actually have a look at dropping in another mesh. So if we look at adding a sword, I have a very crude model I'm going to use. I didn't really have time to make a new one. So we're going to open up meshes. I'm going to right click. So what I've done is I've imported a mesh. I'm not going to make a skeleton mesh because it doesn't have to be. Let's not create a material because we don't need it. We'll just do import all. Don't worry about any errors we got. It's fine. But our sword mesh, we want to open this up. And we can actually add sockets to a static mesh by going to the socket manager. If you don't see socket manager, you can go to Windows and then you can select socket manager here. But all we want to do is hit the plus. And then we're going to call this the same as what our grip is on the weapon, which is grip.2. So let's rename grip.2 like so. And then we can move this up. I'm going to move this up to the hilt. Hit save. And we can simply drag that into the world. So let's lie that down. It's important to note the pivot point is where the first hand will grab it. So let's place it there and hopefully it doesn't fall off. And now from our blueprints folder, so content, VR template, blueprints, grab component, we can just add that to our sword. And in here we can say grab type, we want to snap. We can then use two hands, yes. Snap second hand to socket, exactly what we're going to do. And this time it's going to be a sword. So we hit play. And if we jump in now, we might get some issues because it's not a physics object, which we're doing. So we need to change that. And because it's a static mesh, we're going to set it to movable. That'll allow us to pick it up. We can move it down slightly. And then we can simulate physics. And for the grab, I'm actually going to remove the snap to second hand to socket, even though we've got the option. So we'll see that it falls down now. You can jump right in. We can pick it up. You can actually control the rotation of this by changing the grip. But now we've got a sword which actually controls what we do. And then we can actually have it fight things. So that's one way to do a two-handed weapon system. And to make it rotate the right way, I'm just going to set the grab component to be a rotation of 90 by 90. So when we hit play, we jump back in for the last time. We can grab the sword, it's straight up, and then we've got our second controller, which actually controls whereabouts we have it moved to. So it's like, which is really good. So now we can all act like idiots in VR. We can have two-handed weapons. So, like I said, I'm aware that this was a pretty long one and a pretty complex setup. But hopefully this can get you on track to create some awesome content. And I just want to do a big thank you to all the patrons for making this possible, and especially allowing me to have the time to get it all in place. Because as they've seen in the Discord, this has taken a couple of months to get sorted. So if you're not already, then make sure to join the Discord. Links on the bottom, just there. And then if you've got any questions, you can always ask them over there. But for now, that's pretty much it. And I'll see you then. I'll see you next time. Bye.